The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
If in our imaging of God, and God is the creator, and God speaks the world into being by his storytelling, if you will, he says, this is what's going to happen today, and this is what I want to see in the story, then how is it that we also think about God's plenitude when it comes to his storytelling? God wants lots of stories, not just one.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast. Conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Dr. Jennifer L. Holberg is professor and chair of the English department at Calvin University and co-director of the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing, the home of the Festival of Faith and Writing, which will be happening live and in person next April for the first time since 2018. Her new book is Nourishing Narratives, the Power of Story to Shape Our Faith. In this episode, Dr. Holberg and I talk about the stories, true and false, that we believe ourselves to be living in, and how we might tell better stories for ourselves and others. Dr. Jennifer Holberg, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. I'm excited about your book, Nourishing Narratives. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. You have so many great people on this podcast, so just an honor and a delight to get to chat with you today. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm really grateful for all the great people who are willing to come on, and I'm super excited to talk about nourishing narratives. So let's just start. Why don't you tell me what's the short version of what your book is about, or you can do the long version if you want. We've got 45 minutes.
Well, I guess we'll see. Yeah, with maybe the one question we answer. Nourishing Narratives really comes out of a couple of places. For one thing, I've been an English professor for a long time, but one of the joys of my life is that I get to teach everybody. I do teach English majors, but I actually love to teach the gen ed student. Mm-hmm. You know, the woman who's going to be an engineer, or the man who's going into business, or and folks who maybe came out of high school and don't really think they like to read, and here they are in a British literature survey or a class on epics, and they're thinking, this doesn't mean anything to me. And really what I want to think about, there's a lot of books out there, really good books, that try to talk to you about what you should read. You know, read the classics and become a better person, or 50 Days with Shakespeare, or something like that. And, you know, I'm not as interested in those things as in having us have better toolkits or a toolkit, I guess, for better tools to really engage all the stories that are surrounding us. So one of the big claims of the book is that we're story-shaped people. And by that, I mean, we're just surrounded by them all the time. At a personal level, I mean, did your family tell you that you were the the pretty one, the smart one? Do your siblings think you're the favorite child? Even if you don't think that.
Right.
And how does that shape you? And then in your church community, in your political community, there's all these ways in which we're living with stories, some of which we aren't very self-critical about. Many of them we aren't very self-critical about. And yet they're either constraining us or they're pushing us in ways. So how do we sort of pay attention to those and put them up against the story of the gospel? So the story of the gospel tells me I'm precious and beloved. And yet so much of my culture, and maybe even my family or my church or other communities, are telling me I'm not enough in some kind of way.
Yeah.
And so the book really is, in the beginning, talking about kind of this big idea. And then there's 3 or 4 chapters that want to talk about that in a kind of, and all my social scientists that are listening, it's not really case studies, but kind of. What if we told a different story about God? How would that change the story we told about ourselves? So the first couple of chapters are different stories about God. This kind of hinge chapter is, what if we told a different story about our callings or about our vocations? And then the last bit of the book is really thinking about, well, okay, so if we can interpret better, how does that help us in hard situations, either personally or kind of corporately? So that's kind of the book. It's trying to use stories, and I will give people fair warning. It comes out from InterVarsity Academic, so there are people, I think, who maybe expect something a little bit different than what it is. It's a real hybrid. I tell stories from my own life because I want you to think about stories from yours, but it's not a memoir. Okay. I talk about literature. I talk about movies. I talk about TV. I talk about the Bible, mostly using stories to help you think about story. So it's not a real preachy book. It's not a real academic book. It's really meant for lay people. But it's because I think all of us really need to be attentive to the kind of interpretive frame we're bringing to sort of every part of our life.
Yeah, that phrase, interpretive frame, seems especially helpful here. You know, because we think of it's so helpful to back up and say there is an interpretive frame through which I'm reading everything that's going on around me. I'm not just ingesting reality. The reality is getting put through something which needs to be interrogated, needs to be
exactly
challenged.
So this idea that there's just sort of facts and story are different. I don't actually think that's true. But as you think about facts, as you think about the kinds of ways you're thinking about the world, other people, yourself, God, all of those that's not neutral. Right. And so I want us to think about, what are good ways. And I think the Bible is really an interesting text because it has an interpretive frame built into it. It tells you how to interpret itself. Like if you study the Bible, it's giving you like how you're supposed to do it. And then, of course, we have long traditions, and I do mean that in the plural, right? In our different faith traditions within Christianity that help us also think about that. So, what are you thinking about first? But even little things like, well, maybe not little things, but as you think about other people, right? I mean, how are you thinking of them? Is this a child of God? Well, if that's your metaphor, well, what are the implications of that metaphor? And that if it's not your metaphor, well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about them mostly as sinner or right? And right. They are sinners, that is true, but what are the implications of that? So yeah. And I just think there's so often we get trapped into something, think about how often you or other people you've heard say, well, I couldn't imagine that. I just can't imagine that. Yeah. And that's actually a true statement, right? Like we can't imagine. And so part of the reason we read and watch films and do all the things is hopefully to help us imagine more. I think the problem is there's a really capacious side, right, that can help me understand the world more fully, understand people more fully, see God's creation in all its plenitude. But it can also introduce me to stories that then one of my little mantras with my students is narrative normalizes. Right. So if you hear any story enough time, it starts to sound like that's the way it is. And that can be great because it can be like God loves you. And if you hear that every single day, right, that gets normalized. But if you live in a world where, you're never enough, or America is the only country in the world, or whatever, that starts to become a normal story to you. And you got it. And then it starts to become like, that old David Foster Wallace thing about, what is water? And I think that's our problem as Christians, is that we often get into these kind of cultural stories or stories that have been told in church forever, that maybe arose out of a good spirit or whatever, but they've normalized something that we really need to think about that's not gospel. It's really American or cultural or whatever. And I think that's true in other countries too. I just don't live in those countries.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I just think all of the ways in which, and you see it when people get married, right? And it's like, oh, wait, we don't do this on Christmas Eve. Like we've always done that. Y'all are weird. But that's only because your family story is we open the presents on Christmas Eve, and that's the normal thing. And all of a sudden you're faced with a new story that says, no, we open the presents on Christmas morning after we go to grandma's and have a huge brunch, or, whatever. Yeah. And I think that's a kind of a silly example of it, but that's kind of what I'm saying is how many of the things that we get real upset about are opening the Christmas present on Christmas Eve rather than Christmas Day.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
One thing that stories do for us is they allow us to make some kind of sense out of the sort of chaotic events around us. So part of the job of a story, you can correct me if you think differently, but it's to simplify. And yet that's also the danger of a story, is that it there's always a danger of oversimplification. Yeah.
Well, I think too that they can be simple, but I think part of what we want to push towards is then multiple stories. Right. So lots of little small stories. I think the metaphor as Christians that we should be pushing towards, and really, I think this is true for people who maybe don't have a faith perspective at all, but is the mosaic. Right. You need every little bit. So the simple, you need the one piece of blue. Yeah. And that would be your simple story. But what you really need is all of those then putting together to make the bigger story. And so I think, we have a lot of little stories about how I get through the world. But all of those need to be kind of coming together into something bigger. And that the push to one story, right? There's interesting work, the danger of the single story. That's our problem, is when that one tiny story becomes the only story. So I think it's one of many, and I think we're looking we're looking to be mosaic builders or to be part of that. The other thing is, I think interesting for us to think about is often in most of our stories, we are the hero. We are the, it's the Jennifer show, right? And you matter not because of who you are, but because of who you are in relation to me. And then well, that's actually not, I think, what the Bible teaches us. No. And so I think if we can meditate a little bit on why the New Testament wants to think about God as author and finisher of our faith, right? If he's author and finisher, he's holding the pen, not me. And I become protagonist, not heroine. And I think that's kind of interesting too. But also that if in our imaging of God, and God is the creator, and God speaks the world into being by his storytelling, if you will, he says, this is what's going to happen today, and this is what I want to see in the story. Then how is it that we also think about God's plenitude when it comes to his storytelling? God wants lots of stories, not just one. And so the book has many chapters. And, it always, if you look in the Bible, it's always about more than, one of my favorite things about the feeding of the 5,000, for example, is it would have been much more efficient for Jesus in his wisdom to understand exactly how many people were there, which he obviously could know, and just make enough so that and the Bible could have said something and like everyone ate their fill. But it doesn't say that, does it? It's like, no, they all had enough and there were leftovers.
Yeah.
And I think that and there were leftovers part is really a key part of scripture, right? So is your story asking you to be less, or is it asking you to be more? Is it asking you to see yet again the amazingness of God and God's splendor? Calvin, as a Calvin professor, I'm always contractually obligated to quote Calvin. But, he has this thing that I love in the Institutes where he talks about, heaven, we call heaven God's palace, but everywhere you look, there are sparks of glory.
Yeah.
And I love that. But again, notice they're little sparks. It's not fires of God's glory. It's just like everywhere. And I live in a place with fireflies, and I love to sit out on my porch of an evening and watch those little sparks. There's something kind of magical about that. And so, but Calvin goes on in that part of the Institutes to say, even though there's all these sparks everywhere, scarcely one person in 100 is paying attention. And so this book is very much in the kind of Mary Oliver, Frederick Buechner, all the other great souls in Christendom that are just saying to us, hey, pay attention. But that your life itself is sparkful, right?
Yeah.
It's everywhere, but everywhere you look, there's all these sparks that we should be testifying to. And if we did that, how would that change the way we think about all sorts of other things?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I wasn't familiar with that quote from Calvin, but it reminded me of when you quoted Marilyn Robinson in your first chapter, where she says, I've spent my life watching not to see beyond the world, merely to see great mystery. I typed this up wrong. Basically, I didn't. I'm not looking for extraterrestrial.
Right.
She said, to pay attention to what
actually, I'm going to find it because it's such a great quote, and I just love it so much. And it's very much the partner to the Calvin, which I also have later in the book. But she says, I have spent my life watching, not to see beyond the world, merely to see great mystery, what is plainly before my eyes. I think the concept of transcendence is based on a misreading of creation. With all respect to heaven, the scene of miracle is here among us. And I go on to finish that little section of the book to say, what if we began to imagine our ordinary lives as scenes of miracle?
Yeah.
Because they really are. But again, that's an interpretive frame, right? So often, and you and I are, I don't know, we look like we're in the same age category, sort of deeply middle-aged. But I think one thing that's very interesting if you've lived into middle age is how often people say, well, it wasn't supposed to be like this.
Yeah.
Well, they clearly expected. There's a story that they were expecting that didn't happen, right? Yeah. The story has not come out like they thought, or the things that they bought into as part of the narrative didn't happen. And so now they're having a midlife crisis. They're discontented. And I think some of that's just getting to an age and realizing you've done the thing and now what's the next thing? Mm-hmm. That's a different way to reframe that, right?
Right.
But how often people say, "Oh, is this all there is?" And just all of this sort of narrative discontent that our language shows us that we did have something in mind, and it's not happening. And even the ways I think about this when I travel with students, if they are ready to be delighted, they are.
Yeah.
And if they're not. And so the same exact things can happen in a day. The bus can be late. The food can be, mediocre. We only see like maybe one cool thing. And if they aren't in the right frame of mind, if they're not ready to be delighted, the day goes south. And if they're ready to be delighted, it's still fine. We're having fun. And right. And I do think it's a lot about, and so I spend a lot of time when I travel with students sort of preparing them for things and preparing them for and hey, we're going to get through this. But a lot of that's just, thinking about the story you want to tell for the day. Is this going to be and I'm not, I spend a lot of time in the book sort of trying to go against, I think, what Christian story often does, which is triumphalistic or sort of triply positive. I'm not saying that at all, but I am also saying that as we think about those hard things, as we resist the triumphalistic story, that it's because we have to have a better one that's there. And so how do we begin to tell those kinds of as the book title says, nourishing narrative, and kind of move away from the more toxic ones? And that even comes with things like, what's going to make you successful? Because I think even as we have, good theology in our churches, we often have exactly what our culture teaches us is what makes you successful. Right. Where'd you go to college? What's your job? How many children? It's always something else. Mm-hmm. And one of the chapters really tries to talk about a different kind of, how could we be more satisfied with who we are and try to resist the culture of not enoughness.
Mm-hmm. Except not enoughness is what drives
the world,
all our marketing and
everything. Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, even in Christian circles, right? And I don't. This is not to say I don't believe in sanctification and that we need to continue to move into a greater and greater likeness of Christ. But just think of how often it's like, do better, be better. And I'm like, I mean, this is one reason I'm actually a Calvinist, is because I don't think I have to do the work. In other words, God is doing it. But my response is to try to every day cultivate those habits of mind and heart and hands that are going to help me do that. And that's partly, reminding myself, I'm not enough. And thank God. I mean, there's that great, you probably know it as a Flannery O'Connor story, but that wonderful line of hers about the great scandal of the gospel is that, despite our condition, and I'm not getting it exactly her words, but despite our condition, we were deemed worthy of being died for and saved.
Yeah, I just happened to have run across that this morning.
That's such a great quote, right? I mean, because it identifies who we are, and it's one reason I love O'Connor, that our basic nature is we're freaks, right? And we don't think we're freaks though. And most of the time in her stories, right, it's the people who don't think they're the freaks that are the biggest ones of all.
That's right.
But we're still, despite all of that, despite the fact that we're sort of unfortunate creatures, amazingly, God still wants to die for us. And I think if that's the main story you keep reminding yourself of, is you're a freak, but God loves you anyway.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing. But it also keeps you humble, right? Because I think part of what happens is we begin to say, oh, well, I'm not that bad. And in the beginning of the book, I know you have seen that part. I talk about kind of dominant Christian narratives that I think, the super Christian or, the abject sinner. Yeah. And I think most people then start to say, oh, well, I don't have a story. But of course they do.
Yeah.
But their story is about faithfulness, and it also really obscures. And I think here of O'Connor and some of her characters who think they've got it all together, and of course they don't. And I think one of the things that are a bad approach to story is my sin isn't really real sin. It's only the murderer guy or the lady who's on crack or, it's the bad people who have sin. I don't really have sin, and therefore I don't really have a story, though. Yeah. Right? Because God didn't have to save me. Like those people, oh, golly, God brought them from dark to light. Right. And in my case, did God bring me that far? I mean, you start to see, once you unpack this, how it can be really pernicious. And all of a sudden, God really hadn't done any work in your life, and you're not that bad. And you're like, well, actually,
when I teach writing to Midwesterners, sometimes I have to spend some time convincing them that they actually have a story.
That's very true.
They think this is just the norm. Kansas is just so normal. I got nothing to talk about. You Southerners are lucky. Everything's wacky down there, and you've got all kinds of things to talk about. You got alligators, and you've got we think of ourselves as the norm, and therefore, I mean, that's a narrative frame, right?
Narrative, the norm. Like I say, narrative normalizes.
Yeah.
Right. And what my little small town or my big city or And it's just, yeah, everybody's like me, but that's just not true. And also, we also, if we actually believe that God's saving grace means anything, we have to acknowledge that our sins are also there, and God's work is as powerful in our life in helping us be faithful and kind. And I mean, as someone who's been in one institution for my entire adult life, being together in community is hard. We always say we want that until we actually have to do it. Yeah. And then we're like, yeah, that guy's so annoying. Do I really have to be on a committee with him? Like, God's grace extends to you in a mighty way to serve on committees, right? And I mean, I moved 9 times growing up. And one little joke in my family was that the same people are every place. And that is so true.
That's funny.
Because you go to the church and that same bossy lady is still there. Yeah. And that, but you also still need the same grace and forbearance and love to be in a community with them. And that's, I think, why, when you see people who testify to a long marriage, or people who've been in an institution a long time and they've been, they've made it through, they have a very interesting story, because that took a lot of God's grace, just as much as I think it is to take someone. And I don't want to dismiss, dramatic stories of, God's rescue, or someone being in a what seems like a really impossible place of addiction or something like that. Those are all really wonderful stories too. But I think sometimes people who grow up in church, if they think that's the only story. Yeah. And again, so reductive. And not God has so many sparks, right? Yeah. And so we got to know that guy's, but also the other lady who just seemed to, run the little shop on Main Street for 50 years. But that's not boring either. Like, what's God doing in all our lives, and how do we encourage each other to sort of tell those out?
Yeah. By the way, that the quote from Marilyn Robinson we talked about earlier, what was that from?
It's from her essay on Psalm 8. That early collection she did in the 90s called The Death of Adam. Yeah. It's a really beautiful essay. I recommend the whole thing. Yeah. That's the psalm that begins, what is man that God considers him?
Oh, I remember that.
And so she really goes through and kind of considers that, and why humans have been found. It's very, in some ways, she says she doesn't like O'Connor. She's on the record as saying O'Connor's not her girl. But I actually think that they're she and O'Connor with that same idea about are partly because, they're theologically both, astute.
Yeah. No, it hurts my feelings for my 2 favorites to not
I know, me
like
too.
each other,
Me too. I love Robinson. I've had the opportunity to interview her and be with her a couple of times, and just always just enjoyed her immensely. Yeah. And so, the fact that she just can't see her way to O'Connor does kind of hurt my feelings a little bit. Yeah. I think if they had ever been able to meet, they would have liked each other.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because one thing that people don't always know about Robinson, if they haven't seen her live, is she is a very lively and hilarious person. She has a wonderful sense of humor and is very funny and very down to earth. And I think that just from my reading about O'Connor too, I think they would have liked each other personally. So, one day in heaven.
That's right. That's right. That idea finds its way. The idea that we need to be watching for the stories around us from Robinson makes its way into Gilead, where John Ames talks about the idea that that to the angels we are their Iliad and Odyssey, that they long to look into our stories. And I love that idea.
And I think Gilead is a really wonderful example of something that I'm trying to talk about, which is, we were talking before we got on the air about your background studying Milton. And, there's always that kind of commonplace in literary studies that, the devil is always the most interesting character. And I think that Gilead is really an interesting example where the devil isn't. And I think she's very much trying to write the novel of a good man, and I don't mean that he's sort of, doesn't need salvation, but that
Mhm.
that he's someone who has lived this faithful life in one spot, and that he has this very interesting internal life.
Yeah.
And he's had all kinds of faith struggles and all kinds of sadnesses, the death of his first wife and his child, and finding, and so I think what's interesting about Gilead is that it's such and I think Home too, I've written on Home with the character of Glory, again, someone who is not your flashy, she's the good girl, right? And I joke in the book that my narrative when I was asked to give my testimony in high school was, woohoo, I'm a boring good girl. Like what's the fun in that? And I joked with my mother, like maybe I needed to go out and spice it up a little bit, which did not happen. But I think when we think that that's the only thing, and so I think Robinson does a great service to us in showing us in novel form kind of what that can look like and how glorious it is.
Yeah.
How lovely it is.
That's a great, I love that. It's great insight. Let me also say, Satan is interesting in the first few books of Paradise Lost, but his shtick gets old by the time that thing is over, right?
I agree.
I think it's really boring by the end.
Yeah.
It's the same old over and over again.
Yeah. And there's only really so many things you can do as the bad boy, I mean, and the problem with it is, I think you see this in the romantics, Byron, after a while, okay.
Yeah.
Who's the next person you're going to sleep with? I mean, I guess.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, at some point, it's just not that interesting.
Can you imagine being a priest hearing confession? It's like, these are the same sins over and over. And everybody thinks their sins are exciting. Right. And if you're the guy who has to listen to this every day.
Yeah. And I think too,
where the real interest is.
If you think that's part of what you need to do in the world to be a grown-up, right, is to have interesting sins. I think if you've read enough books, you start to go, I don't know, that it's all been kind of done. I mean, that's why Ecclesiastes is always right? There's nothing new. It might look different and you might be calling it something different, but really as an interpretive frame, And I say this to students. I mean, we're about to start school, and I say to them, this is my 33rd year being a professor. And so by this point, there's really not too much that I haven't seen, in terms of emergencies that people have, and I can deal with it. Right. So it's new for you. And it feels overwhelming to you, but I'm here and I won't be surprised. And if I am, well, okay, but we'll deal with that. But typically I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised when you get homesick a couple weeks in, or when you haven't done your work, or, and I think I just want to lower their anxieties to say, I have seen this and you'll be okay. And I'm here to help.
Yeah.
So, I was one of the metaphors I love of Christian higher education is that we ought to be rafters together. But if you fall out of the boat, I'm gonna get you back in. It's okay, right? But I think so often students struggle in school partly because they have this narrative. They're embarrassed. They feel ashamed, but all of those things. And I think there's so much great work out there by social scientist Brene Brown. I adore because she's all about breaking that narrative that is trapping you in shame or fear or whatever it is. And I think, when Jesus talks about the abundant life, that's true. But what does that look like then? What does the abundant life look like? It's not just stuff. In fact, it's not really stuff. It's really a mindset where you're going to have enough. It's, I talk in the book about Walter Brueggemann, and his famous book from the 70s, about, having a mindset of either plenitude or lack, and that the Israelites really struggle with that. Like, at least if we go back to Egypt, we have control. Here we have to not have control, even though God's going to take care of us and give us enough. That's really hard to trust. In the abstract, when you're
that narrative of lack is so again, it's really good for controlling other people if you can keep them in the mindset of lack. And I'm the one person, I alone can fix it. That's a really good way to keep people in line, under control, in my power.
Yeah, and I
And
think that happens in churches. I think it happens in governments. I think it, right? Because partly it's really hard to trust that God's got you.
yeah,
And if you're guaranteed your next meal, and people are really always willing to make themselves smaller if they feel that there's, comfort there. And so I think we have to keep reminding ourselves about how God doesn't want us to be less. And we shouldn't be in any kind of relationships, whether with our churches or with our intimate partners or with our parent, whoever it is. If they're asking you to be less, then that's really not of God. And how do we help each other be more? Because God really wants us to be more.
yeah,
And the world is full of more. I mean, I just, you look at nature and there's just, biodiversity is the most, like, such an important concept. So how do we cultivate, I talk in the book, T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets has this wonderful thing that says he'll know he was had a successful life because he nourished the life of significant soil. And I love that. I think that's lovely. In other words, all you got to be is good dirt. And I think in a world where it's like, what was your latest thing? And it's made me laugh a little bit. My book came out July 25th and people are already like, what's the next one? I'm like, I don't know. But it was a kind thing to think that I would have a next one, but also like, what have you done for me lately? And it's always, oh, you got married. When are you having children? Oh, you have children. When are you doing this? Oh, what if we just kind of were in the thing, right? What if today, I'm a single person and students will say to me, well, Professor Holberg, when were you called to be single? And I'm like, there was no day or time, just like way led to way. And as you're thinking about that in your own life, everyone's so future oriented that they're never in their present.
Yeah.
And today I got enough to do. I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a professor, I'm a colleague, I'm a friend. I got a lot to do. And so what if I'm always thinking about what I'm not?
Yeah.
It never lets me be who I am.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that people shouldn't plan or hope for things, but I also think today, wow, I got a lot.
Yeah.
There is so much filling up my life. And if I could meditate on that and be grateful and thankful for that and think about all of the things I get to do rather than what I'm not doing, I'm like, actually, I don't have time for this other thing.
But that's also a question of a narrative frame, right?
Exactly.
When you get married, the next question is when you're going to have kids. And when you have kids, the next question is what are you going to do for empty nesting, or whatever. We've got this idea. And you've already mentioned the idea of you've related midlife crises to these stories, but I'd never thought about it before. But every midlife crisis that's ever happened was because I had a narrative, and this is not what the narrative is turning out to be.
That's exactly right.
Instead of receiving what I'd have been given, I've got this idea of the way things are supposed to be.
Yes. And I think we always are expecting a story, right? There's I quote in the book, John Edwards, the presidential candidate who flamed out and was unfaithful in his marriage. And the Detroit Free Press interviewed his wife. And she said, they sort of said, well, how are you? The question was basically like, how are you coping with being, publicly humiliated? And she said, for me, it's about understanding the story I'm in. I thought I was in one novel, and it turns out I was in another one.
Yeah.
And that always stayed with me. I thought that was such an interesting way to think about it. Like, she was in her own mind in her marriage, thought she was one thing and they were going to do this thing and be the president. Right. And it turns out she's living in a whole different novel. Yeah. And I think sometimes we're living in the wrong novel. Yeah. Or, we think we've embraced a story that's just not thick enough. Right. It's the thin soup. And you've bought into it because you've decided that's going to be the way that you're going to be happy and successful. And when I get this, or I do this, or I'm with this person, and it turns out and we know this, our theology teaches us that won't be the thing. And yet we buy into it all the time. So then we're, I talk with my students about 19th century novels where, virtue is rewarded. Mm-hmm. So, and I think a lot of Christian teaching around marriage and singleness is about, be virtuous because you're going to get rewarded. Mm-hmm. Not because you should be virtuous, but because Mr. Darcy is coming.
Yeah.
And just wait it out, but not too long. You won't be more than your early 20s. And, you'll go to Christian college and you'll find Darcy will be there. Well, but then what if he isn't? Mm-hmm. And so then you get to be 30. And if you look at a lot of the singles literature, a lot of it is about, well, I thought I was virtuous. Mm-hmm. Why have I not been rewarded? Or was I not virtuous? Does God not reward me? Right. And you can see how the whole thing is a hot mess. Mm-hmm. And neither side is the right approach, but there's nothing to replace it. And therefore it's like, I don't know what to do because my church community doesn't really embrace me until I'm a married person. Mm-hmm. My church doesn't embrace me because they think I'm still basically a kid until I do certain things. Yeah. And I just think, so I think the church has a lot of work to do in examining its own narratives and the ways in which, when we think about all these folks today who are deconstructing or just downright leaving the church, or, I saw a thing the other day that said by, the 2030s, a much smaller percentage of America is going to be Christian. Why is that? Well, I would argue it's because our churches are also serving thin gruel, and they're not giving stories that really they've embraced a little bit too much of the culture. Sometimes for good reasons, right? I'm wanting to fight promiscuity and things like that, but not offering a narrative that's really going to be a lifelong thing. And they've got it. They just aren't tapping into it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think when you're talking about when Mrs. Edwards says, I thought I was living in one story, it turns out I was living in another.
Yeah.
I also was reflecting on the truth that so often we say the story we think we're in her case, maybe she was overly optimistic about what story she was in, but so often we say, I know this story. I know how this story ends.
Yeah.
And the gospel says, no, you don't know how the story ends, or
that's right.
It ends. I think it was Buechner who talks about, tragedy is about what's inevitable and comedy is about what's unexpected. And the gospel is comic in that regard. You
right.
When I look around and see how things are going to play out, it doesn't look like they're going to end well. And then the gospel says, no, turns out this is a comedy you're living in.
Exactly right. And Buechner says what death is only the penultimate word, right? But I do think that it's a sense of control, right? Well, I know, and it's predictable. I love Barbara Brown Taylor has a great little quip that she said to me a long time ago at the Festival of Faith and Writing, and it's the idolatry of omnicompetence. Right?
Wow.
The idolatry of omnicompetence. Isn't that so genius?
Yeah.
And I just love that because we do worship the idea that if we just can make all the right choices, we can control things. We're going to know yep. And then this is going to happen. And then this is going to happen. And that's just not true. I mean, if you've lived any part of life, you know,
if you're paying attention,
right? If you pay attention, everything is unexpected.
Yeah.
I fell downstairs and broke my foot. No one planned that.
Yeah.
My mother died of a brain aneurysm when she was 55. No one planned that.
Yeah.
So the question is, but do you are you wrecked by that? Or do you say, well, I didn't know what was going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
There's a great little story by Margaret Atwood called Happy Endings. And it's a little short story. It's only 2-3 pages long. And the first one, it's story A, and it's about John and Mary, and they live this life and they do all the things and they have all the children and the house and the boat, and they live to old age. And then the last sentence of the little story is John and Mary died, John and Mary died, John and Mary died. And then she's like, let's do variations of this. And every variation she changes a little bit, but at the end it's always John and Mary died, John and Mary died, John and Mary die. And then at the end, the narrator comes in and says, see, so endings don't matter. It's only the middle. It's only how you live. And when I teach that story, I always say, now what's the Christian response to this? Because the end of the story is not John and Mary die, John and Mary die, John and Mary die, right?
Yeah.
The middle isn't the only interesting part. And all of a sudden that kind of clicks in to say, like, Atwood has a very particular point of not, as a not Christian person, like that is the story. The middle part is the most important, whatever you do. And the most interesting part of the story is the part that you're living in the middle, because everyone's end is going to be the same. Okay. And we can even think that's somewhat interesting in terms of the way we approach our lives and live them. But I would say a Christian response to this story is no, that's not the end.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's the fact that we're eternal now and we're going to keep living. So this is only, chapter 1 of the story.
Yeah.
There's more chapters to come. So anyway,
yeah.
I just think that's really, there's a lot of fascinating, once you start looking for it, and even as you look at the way people speak, you start to see how this narrative frame is really a strong one.
Yeah.
And I want people to think too about the movies they watch, the TV, the all of that, because there's lots of stuff that we think about as entertaining that is really discipling us. Right. I think what you live with every day, you may think it's entertaining you, but it is teaching you something. And not that we can't be discerning or whatever, but I do think that it's kind of fascinating. I have students who tell me, they have one particular view theologically about their dating life, but they also love The Bachelor. Right. And The Bachelor's fun and whatever. But if you watch a lot of The Bachelor, that really normalizes a certain kind of view. Or if you love the romantic comedy where they meet cute and hate each other, and the woman turns down the man, or vice versa, but it's usually the other way. And then the idea of romantic comedy is, no, she didn't really turn you down. She just wants you to work harder. Well, all of a sudden, like, that's deeply problematic. If that was happening in real life, I'd be reporting you to campus safety.
Yeah, right.
But in the movies, men are trained in romantic comedy to know, just try harder. Ask her 16 more times. Show up outside her dorm, and she'll give in if you hold up a boombox. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas in real life, that is like, no, I told you no, please go away. And I just think there's lots of things like that if you start sort of looking at the narratives, you start to say, wow, I'm really imbibing some things that maybe I shouldn't be imbibing.
Yeah. All right, Jennifer, we got to wrap this up.
Yeah.
I could talk all day, but I do want to hear you talk a little bit about the Festival of Faith. I usually ask people who the writers make you want to write. In your case, I'm changing the last question because I want to hear about the Festival of Faith and Writing.
Yeah.
You co-chair.
Yes.
You tell me.
Yeah, no. And if people want to know who I like to read, read the book, because it is a compendium of poems and stories, and love so many people. But my point is basically read, and read what you like, and make sure you're thinking about it. But yes, no, I'm delighted to announce that we're going to have our first in-person Festival of Faith and Writing. We had to postpone the 2021 because of COVID, and then 2022 was only online. So back in person after 6 years.
Excellent.
It's going to be April the 11th through the 13th, 2024. And this year we're going to be adding a new day of workshops for people who are writers. We'll also have a few that are for readers, and maybe some other kind of spiritual practices. Those are being finalized right now. But September 1, we'll be announcing all of the writers. If you go to our website, CCFW, that stands for the Calvin Center of Faith and Writing, who runs the festival, ccfw.calvin.edu. You can see our full thing. We also have a monthly newsletter. We don't bother you any other time, but it also keeps you up to date on all that's happening in our world. So hope people will come. It's going to be amazing. And we're so excited to be back together again, talking about the intersections of faith and writing, both kind of broadly defined.
Well, I hope I can go.
I would love to see you there.
Yeah.
That'd be so fun. Writing a book.
Thank you so much. I love the work you're doing, and thanks for the Festival of Faith and Writing.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So many good things have come from that.
Many hands put it together. So I can't really take too much credit. There's been over 30 years of people working on it. So thank you for the good work you do here, really bringing wonderful writers and conversations out to our world. So I really appreciate you as well.
Well, I hope we can talk again soon.
Okay, great.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.